My name is Lisa Nestor, and I work on our ecosystem strategy team at the Stellar Development Foundation, and I will be providing moderation support during our discussion today. So the topic on the table for this virtual roundtable is a direct send proposal. This is a discussion continued from exactly 2 weeks ago on April 16th. And we will be talking through and finalizing the direct send SEP proposal. First, however, I'd love to give just a little bit of background on what a SEP is. This is a Stellar native term. And so SEP stands for Stellar Ecosystem Proposal. So SEPs are publicly created open source documents that live in a GitHub repository, and they facilitate the creation and eventual adoption of technical standards within the Stellar ecosystem. So SEPs are really a dynamic way of introducing standards and protocols utilized in the ecosystem built on top of the Stellar network. And in particular, as new use cases evolve throughout the Stellar ecosystem, new SEPs help to formalize those use cases and make them increasingly easy to implement and streamline between various participants. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about the direct send SEP. People are also referring to this as a send receive SEP. And the purpose of this SEP is really to enable fiat to fiat payments that would be facilitated between two anchors. We also think of this as being a SEP to support more traditional style cross-border payments in which a sender executes a transaction to a receiver in a foreign destination and really wants that receiver to just have funds arrive in their bank account. They don't really want to interact with a wallet or a digital asset themselves. So like a remittance or a business payment, the transaction is executed and the receiver can just collect the funds. To date, there have been some initial decisions made around this SEP, and we've linked to the specific GitHub pull requests there. So to move forward, let me quickly introduce our participants today. We have 4 different companies from the Stellar ecosystem, representatives from each of these companies that will be joining us. So we have Anthony from Tempo, we have Andy from Satoshi Pay, Bubemi from Kauri, Claudio from Finclusive, and Michael from SDF. So thank you all so much for joining us and being patient this morning. And so finally, this is what today's agenda will be. We are going to work hard to talk through each of these line items. So if you're in the stream, feel free to kind of follow along with us. And with that, I will hand it over to Michael from SDF to help kick things off. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so really quickly, can you go back to the agenda, Lisa?
Yes.
Cool. So last week we talked a lot about the happy path for this proposal, and I think we got it to a really good place. We had some updates from the conversation, and I think that we're pretty happy with where it is for the happy path, where it's simply 2 anchors that have, good financial partnerships or are financial institutions themselves. And then what we're going to talk about today are some additions that might become a part of the SEP or might become a part of an additional SEP that make it possible for a lot more parties to participate in this network of fiat to fiat rails. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a multilateral KYC, and Finclusive is going to give us an update about what that is. And I think the general idea here is it makes a much easier way for multiple parties to share KYC data, so everybody doesn't have to duplicate efforts, and people who might not be able to get involved previously can through this process. And then we're going to talk about how non-custodial applications, so non-custodial wallets, can start to execute these direct send transactions. So I'm going to pass it over to Claudio. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. You're closer than Lisa to pronounce my name correctly. So what we are doing at Ficlusive and what we are trying to achieve with the multilateral KYC, and what's, let's say, our role in the Stellar network. So mainly on Ficlusive, we are focusing on compliance checks, KYC, KYB, and CDD, continuous due diligence, monitoring and reporting. Right, multilateral KYC as a little bit of background, and maybe you already touched it in the last discussion. Like each anchor for each payment, right, has to do a KYC on the sender. Let's say if we are talking from the anchor to anchor SEP, which is on the agenda, and also the receiving anchor from the regulatory point of view also needs to do a KYC on the sender, right? And the sender anchor also on the receiver. So KYC multilateral, also how we are calling it CDD Connect, basically we will enable through our CAS product, which is also API based, to share this information. And by this information, I'm referring to the KYC data without any personal information attached to it, right? So as an example, for example, let's say one anchor from Europe wants to do a payment to an anchor from Nigeria, for example, right? And the anchor from Europe already onboarded, let's say, the sender using our CAS APIs, and then also the anchor from Nigeria is using our CAS APIs, right? So when the anchor from Nigeria will do the sender KYC, basically we are not performing another KYC check. Basically, we are just sharing the existing data and let's say report and history of the sender, which was already made for the anchor from Europe, right? So basically, this is KYC Connect or CDD Connect, right? And what this brings into the table, it brings, I think, cost reductions, right? Because it reduces costs. It also makes the process more efficient, right? Because but just by enabling sharing data. Also, this process is almost instant. Like it doesn't involve the basic KYC checks and KYB checks. Doesn't involve too much manual interaction, but of course it can be extended with checks which will involve some, let's say, offline processing in case of, you want to do extra due diligence on a certain entity or individual. Also, let's say, this multilateral KYC is not, let's say, enforcing an anchor to just, do KYC in a single way. Basically, it will just try to provide the framework, but each anchor can have its own particularities. For example, to extend KYC, its own services or whatever, third-party tools they are using, right? What else? So we already started discussion. I think our CEO is in contact with most of the anchors which are present right now in the call to agree upon, let's say, requirements and use cases which all of us try to fulfill on the Stellar network.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and we are more than welcome. Everybody else who wants to join this initiative.
Great.
Cool. So this excites me for two reasons. I think what this gives us, Lisa, sorry, were you about to say something? Okay, so this excites me for two reasons. One is what you said, you mentioned it as cost savings, and I think it's more than that. I think it enables, the cost savings come from, right now, every anchor kind of has to be a specialist in the KYC of every region, which is obviously a huge cost, and also just, it's not going to happen. So this kind of says, this one company is going to focus on KYC in different regions, and now everybody else doesn't have to. So that's a cost savings, and it allows, no company is going to be able to have a team large enough to really work all over the world. And the second thing that it does, and correct me if I'm wrong here, this is This kind of goes to the last point in that subsection, was it enables people who may not be able to do actual KYC, people who are not financial institutions such as Satoshi Pay. This will allow them to kind of offload the KYC process onto Finclusive. So when they start a process, they can get KYC done through a regulated institution like Finclusive. And all the other parties in this multilateral agreement can accept it, and that will regulatorily allow Satoshi Pay to start creating these transactions. So there's two things blocking them. One is the technical way, does it fit into the SEP, and one is the regulatory way. Will other parties accept payments that originated from a non-custodial wallet? So am I correct in saying that this will solve those two problems?
Yes, you're right. You're right. We provide everything you said. Cool. And that's true. So basically, that's our mission, to provide easy access to compliance services and also, to banking integrations.
And then
yes, that's also from our side. That sounds like that's what we're aiming for.
Cool.
I'm interested to hear from the anchors. Does that make sense from your perspective? Just kind of given how you typically handle your responsibilities?
So certain regulations require the anchors to process the KYCs themselves. So we are only allowed to offload it, so to speak. However, depending on how much access we have to any other central KYC processor, then as long as we have, like deep access to the data and so on and so forth, we could probably still meet the regulatory requirements, saying that yes, we did do this KYC, we did have access to the KYC data, and we can share it with the regulator.
And when you do your own processing, like you just said, this is only in your own home country, right? So you still don't need to specialize in KYC for other countries, just yourself.
Yes, correct. So it's to meet the regulatory requirement in our jurisdiction, the regulator that's in our country specifically.
And in this multilateral agreement, is that something that's allowed where a receiving anchor can pull the data down, or is it obfuscated behind a token?
We need to have the actual data to meet the regulatory requirement. So it can't be obfuscated. We have to have access to the live data, and in certain situations, required to share that data with the regulator. So, for example, if there's an investigation or something like that, they would need to see the actual data. So we can't have it obfuscated. We need to actually access it. In the current situation where we process it ourselves, anyway, we would actually process and store that data, so it wouldn't be obfuscated to satisfy our regulator.
So, Claudiu, is that something that's possible with your scheme?
Yeah. So basically, just to make things a little bit clearer. You, for example, in Nigeria, you have the data, you want to do the KYC check on it, right? So what you will do, you will just call us and we will just see if those persons were already KYC'd, right? And we have a report on them. And of course, only if the institutions, like the anchors who are participating in this one, are willing to share the information about them, right? Because each country might have its own regulation. Like, for example, I don't know, in a certain country, maybe you're not allowed to share the KYC information, even though if it's not the personal information, right? So basically, each anchor will own the personal information. Yes, we will also have it, but you will get back the KYC data, right? So you will not get anything obfuscated on it, right?
Okay,
because
so any data that's shared from one anchor who's part of this multilateral agreement, that data can then be pulled down by a receiving anchor who's also part of the agreement.
Exactly, exactly.
So it's a full data sharing agreement. It's not like we're just saying, well, we trust that Finclusive did it, so we're cool with everything. We can actually pull whatever we need down.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Okay. That sounds. It sounds like it solves the problem from Kyrie's end. I don't know if Anthony, from Tempo's end, does that sound right to you? Does that sound like it'll solve any problems from your end?
It could. There's EU regulation that's going in place where they have to be authorized by the EU Central Bank as a KYC provider.
So that's something where Finclusive would have to get this authorization from the EU.
Yeah. Yep. And it's right now. I don't think they've actually approved anybody. There's a bunch of companies in application process, but that's the current state in EU. And then we're also doing it in Japan, and in Japan, it's a little bit more lenient. They don't require this sort of artificial intelligence on the passport and ID.
And we typically consider the EU to be kind of one of the more strict jurisdictions. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Specifically, Japan and Germany and Switzerland are the strictest.
Okay.
And then France comes right after, I would say.
Okay.
Cool. And then, I mean, the nice thing about that is that's Finclusive's bread and butter, is to get authorized by all these places so that everybody else doesn't have to. So, okay. It sounds like to me that scheme does solve the regulatory issues with Satoshi Pay and other non-custodial wallets being able to get KYC data into the system and be trusted from that end. Lisa, can you share a link to that agenda that I can pull up? I think the next thing that we want to talk about is the technical aspects of it. So I guess we can look at some more of these questions. So we're asking if the strategy works for everybody. It sounds like, assuming that Finclusive gets authorization from the EU to provide this kind of data, that this will actually solve a lot of these problems. We asked about if there's any geographies or scenarios where this may break down. And we kind of talked about how, in Europe things are stricter, but it doesn't break down as long as the providing company can get authorized in that geography. And then if we're looking at edge cases where this may not work, I think one of the edge cases is the case where the receiving anchor actually needs more data. So, I'm imagining a situation where a sending client comes in a very lenient state, provides, some data that might get them access to their originating country's regulations. But once you're trying to send to somewhere in the EU, the case, it might be that they need more information. They're much stricter. And so I'm curious how Finclusive would imagine this working. Do we ask the receiving anchor to collect more data, or does Finclusive say, okay, well, now that you're going to the EU, we're going to have to collect more data? Do we have any idea how that would work?
Yeah, so we had a thought and discussion internally about this, and to be honest, it depends on the customer, right? Because each customer has its own needs. But how we want to address it is like each customer will, let's say, like a compliance customer of ours can define its own list of extra fields they want to collect, right? Besides our core fields, which we provide by default for doing KYCs, KYBs on individuals and entities, right? And at least this is how we are thinking to do it. And of course, if, for example, a field makes sense for us also to include it by default in the core fields, we can do this. And for example, I can give you an example as a result of the discussion we had with Kauri. For example, they requested to have a custom field called the BVN, a bank validation number, which is specific to Nigeria. And to validate this field, we had to integrate a specific API from Nigeria to do that, right? And then we had an internal discussion, and what we decided is that look, this is a core field for Finclusive, because not only Kauri needs it, all the entities or individuals from Nigeria need this kind of validation if we want to offer them the compliance check they need, right, in that specific country and region. So that's what I'm saying. It depends on the case, right? Because if something can be made as a core field, we will include it as a core field, and it's enabled by all the countries, to all customers from a certain country or a certain region, right? If it's something specific, let's say not to a country or region, but to a company or entity or individual, it can be addressed but through configuration. So we thought on this, and at least these are the two directions we want to go, if it makes sense.
So when the KYC is originally being provided, when an originating anchor initially collects the data, are they collecting that data with the knowledge of where it's going to go, so that they can say, they can tell you, hey, we want to send this to the EU. What do we need to collect? Or do they just collect the data for their own region and send it to you? And then later on in the process, the receiving anchor will then ask you for the data.
Yeah, okay. So how I'm seeing this process is that I think through the steps which are available on the Stellar protocol, like each anchor will define its fields he needs for KYC, KYB, right? So basically, when this information is exchanged between anchors, each anchor will know, like for example, maybe an anchor which is using Finclusive as a compliance provider, maybe will interact with an anchor which doesn't use Finclusive as a compliance, right? And this is, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, this is embedded in the SEPs, right? The fields you can share between anchors. So each anchor should be responsible to configure these fields, even if it's a custom field, for example, and maybe it's not on I think it's SEP 9, which has the list of the fields, right? It still can be requested through this exchanging of fields, right? And yeah, of course, if it's viable for you also, can be also added on the list, right?
Okay, so it sounds like it's the responsibility of the originating anchor to make sure that they're giving you enough data so that
exactly.
when you pass it off to the recipient,
and of course, some of the fields can be made optional, some of the fields can be made required, right? So you can have this flexibility, right, to jungle with the fields.
Cool. Does anyone else see any edge cases where this scheme might fall apart?
Oh, okay, so it sounds okay, but generally what we do, because when a client onboards for the first time, you might not necessarily know all his intended jurisdictions, like you might not know everywhere he intends to send to going forward. But what we tend to do is, as we onboard a client, we would say, we would ask them which countries or which regions are you sending to, or do you intend to send to now or in the future, kind of thing. And based on that, if, for example, if they have payments that are going to Europe or want to include Europe as one of their destinations, then we would try and acquire the KYC information required for Europe. If it's to US, we would try and acquire it for US. So we take the responsibility as an anchor that's initiating payments to get the correct information for the correct destination. As it's business-to-business payments and there's a very involving onboarding process, we can ask the client front that, okay, are you going to enable the US route? Are you going to enable the European route? And that way we can, we have a better idea of what KYC information we would need for their destination. So that's how we handle it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think this all makes sense. There's also the case where, for example, for a very large transaction, we might, the receiving anchor might need extra data. And I think this is fine. The way that it would work is in the step right now, the sending anchor kind of checks the status of the transaction periodically, and it might find out, oh, there's actually more data needed. So in this case, would they provide it directly to the anchor, or would they provide it to Finclusive and then tell the anchor we've updated their kind of KYC profile with extra data that you needed? I actually don't think it matters. I think both ways would work just fine.
I think from my perspective, and at least how we are placed right now, I think is the anchor responsibility, because basically how I'm seeing things, Inclusive with his compliance service sits under the anchor, is not exposed to the anchor, right? Because all what you get exposed to the anchor is just the API definitions, which are guided by SEPs, right? So in any SEP right now, there is no mention of Inclusive, no mention of compliance engine, right? So basically, the anchor is responsible to integrate with Inclusive through a SEP, right? A SEP which collects the KYC information. At least this is how I'm seeing things right now. Maybe in the future.
I think we lost you. Is everybody else still here?
I'm still here. Yeah, I think we got just a little delay there.
Okay.
I do have one or two comments or questions. So I kind of on topic. One of them is, Michael, we historically had a compliance service or compliance server as part of the Stellar ecosystem stack. Did you all consider using that? And why or why not?
Yeah, I think that's SEP 3. I'm just going to pull it up real quick. There were aspects of it that we used for sure. And there were aspects of it that didn't quite work. This is a good question, and I think I should put some information about that. The answer is I would need to go back and kind of collect the answer to that. I don't have it offhand. I do know that we referenced, if you're talking about SEP 3, we referenced it in a lot of ways, but there were a lot of hiccups to it that made it more difficult.
It's Anthony. I can add to that because we were using it quite a bit. The compliance server. It's a lot. This new implementation is a lot simpler and cleaner, and the compliance server was a little bit complicated to implement, and it's a little bit different from the other like SEP 24. So this will keep everything kind of in with one authentication mechanism, SEP 10, and one kind of signing of the data.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Thanks, Anthony. Great. And so one other comment that I'll bring in before we jump back into things is, we're talking a lot about sharing KYC data between anchors. Can anyone speak to how we ensure that this data is treated securely as part of this process? How does a consumer using an anchor know that any personal information they share is going to be treated securely throughout this kind of anchor to anchor KYC exchange process?
Yeah, so I think there's a few aspects of that to look at. One is technically, how is this actually secured? But I think the more interesting question is business-wise. We are sharing data between entities. So how do we ensure, that your personal data doesn't get sent to some shady anchor that, steals it and does whatever with it? So from the technical side, I think, everything's obviously encrypted. I think the SEP makes it clear that this has to be, all of our steps basically say you have to use HTTPS, so everything that's encrypted over the wire. Everything is authenticated using SEP10, which is a cryptographically secure way to say that only authenticated people can access this. So people who are part of this network have all agreed on a public key with each other so that they can authenticate with each other. So I think it's safe to say that for all reasonable intents and purposes, this data can only be accessed by the parties who are involved in this agreement. Now, the interesting part of the question is, how do we know who's part of this agreement? How do we know who can actually access our data? And I think the answer to that is, anyone who's part of this multilateral agreement knows who else is part of this agreement. So you are, as a user, you're giving your data to a company that you trust. If you're giving your data to a company you don't trust, like, all bets are off. So, you've kind of entered into this by saying, I trust Cowrie to deal with my data. And implicitly you're saying, I also agree that the people that Cowrie shares this data with, I also trust. But we do get into kind of a more, that's a much bigger leap. Does anyone else have any thoughts on kind of the trust story here involved with personal data?
Yes, so from my point of view, or our point of view, I think it would make a lot of sense if the user would sign something like a piece of data that says, I want to, or I agree to share my data with AnchorX. So also AnchorX can later, or the KYC provider, Conclusive, can later prove that the user was informed about that their data is going to be shared because they signed that piece of data. So it's like a contract between two parties.
Yeah, I think it's a much clearer story when a user comes to Cowrie, puts in their data. Clearly, they trust Cowrie with the data, and then they actually go to send the money, and it says we're going to go through Tempo. I don't know if the UI actually tells them what they're going through, but pretty much they're saying, I want to put my data in for this transfer from between these two companies. So I trust that these two companies will treat my data properly. The question that comes up is, since we have this multilateral agreement, can a third company come in and just request Michael Feldstein's data from Conclusive? If a kind of sketchy company gets it. So there's I guess there's two questions here that I have for the Conclusive product is, does every party that's already involved in the multilateral agreement have to agree to a new party entering? And then second question, can any party at any time just request data that's been entered into this pool? Or is it only possible when a user agrees that they want, that's the other party they want involved with their data?
Mm-hmm. So sorry for dropping off, but I have some internet issues, seems so. So it depends, to answer your question, because I think it depends on the regulations. For example, in the US regulation, by law, you can share KYC data, not personal data, but you can share KYC data, right? So let's say, for example, if Europe is the same, and by law you are allowed to share KYC data, not personal information data. Let's say if when an anchor from US is doing payments and transaction with an anchor from Europe, for example, there is no need for an agreement because we are not sharing personal information. We are just sharing KYC
what
data.
the difference is between KYC data and personal information?
Yes, KYC data. For example, I've checked you on the sanction list of ABI. You're not there, but it's not showing the name it was checked, right? Okay, I checked you on OFAC list or UN list or something else. You're not there, right? Or whatever sanction list or address match or things like that. So you don't get in the KYC data any personal information, right?
So the KYC data is the result of processing
the personal. Exactly. So the anchor has the personal information. It sends either the personal information or either just an identification or a hash or something on that personal information. We are still working on this. And if we already have the KYC for that unique entity or person, we just share the KYC data, which doesn't contain any personal information. And again, that's why I said it depends, because it depends on the regulation. Like maybe in some country or regions, you are not allowed to share KYC data, even though it doesn't contain any personal information, right?
So for the case of sharing personal information, like we talked about earlier, this process does allow for a receiving anchor to pull down the personal information. Like Bubemi said, you know, they need to be able to share that with regulators. They need to know, you know, they need to actually get the data. So does that process for an anchor actually pulling down personal data, how is that controlled?
I think that should be controlled at anchor level and sub level. I think you guys already have this in the first, I think it was set 3 or something with payments from anchor to anchor, in which when you were requesting personal information for a certain entity or individual involved in a transaction from another anchor, that anchor would have like a check on this information, like it's shareable or not, or something like this. Right. So I think that should be, and as you guys mentioned, I think somebody mentioned, it should be a contract signed between anchors, right? To be able to do this, either to anchors, either like at the entity or individual level, right? Maybe when you starting a transaction, you can ask him, okay, are you willing to share your personal information? And maybe a note, if you're not willing to share your personal information, it means that maybe we cannot proceed the transaction or something, right? Depending on the regulation.
But is there any way for someone to say, I'm willing to share my personal information with just these 2 entities versus I'm willing to share my personal information with anyone involved in the multilateral agreement?
Yes, I think it's possible, but to be honest, I don't know whose responsibility should be. Like it should be the anchor responsibility to collect this data and to store it, right? And to do the check, okay, am I allowed to share the information with this certain entity or individual, or with this provider, let's say, or with this anchor, or it should be the inclusive responsibility to collect this data and went on this multilateral thing just to check if I'm allowed to share things, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But again, we are not trying to share personal information. We are trying to share KYC data, right? So that's the purpose.
Okay. It seems like an aspect that we really need to dig into and make sure that was a really good question. I'm glad somebody brought it up. I'm not certain that we have an exact answer for this, but it seems like
Sure.
if we're going to have this a way for anchors to download personal data,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to need some pretty good controls on who can actually do that. Otherwise, you know, it's a broad pool of putting your data out there.
Yeah.
So I guess a more straightforward question is the first one. In this multilateral agreement, how does that pool grow? Does everybody in the pool have to agree to every new addition?
And just one thing, Michael, I do want to call attention to the time. So as much as we can eventually move the discussion to the point 3, I think that would be great to do. So, but don't want to interrupt you from this.
I think that was we need to dig into that a bit.
Okay.
We don't do it on the call. So yeah, let's take a look at that next section.
Okay, great. So Andy, did you want to give a bit of an intro on this?
Yes, of course. We have a bit of an unusual use case from an anchor's perspective, considering what we discussed so far, because we are a non-custodial application and we want to take part in that direct send process. So right now we have 2 approaches that we are trying or discussing internally at Satoshi Pay. And for those 2 processes, we have 2 different flows. We have 2 requirements, like one each, how would we take part, how would we facilitate the direct send, even though we are not an anchor. So our use case is actually that we have a client who is in charge of their own funds. They own their secret key. And we want to use the direct send API between anchors or to another anchor. So like one option we are looking into right now is that basically it happens anchor to anchor. And we would need some way to initiate the whole payment flow. Like we as a third party would need a way to tell anchor A, the sending anchor, to actually start a payment to anchor B. This is one option that we have. The other one is from a receiving anchor's perspective, that we would basically be the sending anchor in some sense, but we would actually send the money from the user's account, from the client's account, or rather the client sends it, as we're non-custodial. And for that, we would need to be able, as the direct send proposal states, that the endpoint is not supposed to be public. There's like a whitelist of entities that are able to use that endpoint, usually anchors. We would not only be able to have us whitelisted as Satoshi Pay, but we would need to be able to have like sub-accounts. So like we have a Satoshi Pay identity, and we have our clients, and our clients would need, like the keys of our clients would need to be whitelisted to participate in that direct send. I hope that makes it halfway clear, even though it's a lot to paint in the air.
So maybe we can get some kind of thoughts from Bubemi or Anthony about how they imagine the ability to actually take these as the receiving end of this.
Yeah, so yeah, it would be based on the keys. I think that would be the most straightforward implementation. For every key that is the initiator of a transaction, which would be Satoshi Pay's customer, we would need to know that key. I believe the direct send protocol makes use of the SEP10 authentication scheme, right? So we can verify that an incoming transaction was signed by your originating key. So basically, we just need to know or have a process where Satoshi Pay would register each individual key with us, maybe as part of their onboarding process or something. So they would say, okay, this key belongs to me, belongs to Satoshi Pay, or belongs to one of Satoshi Pay's customers. And then we would essentially whitelist that particular key. And when the send receive API is being called, it would need to be authenticated with step 10, so that we know that this transaction was signed by this key, which was whitelisted and it belongs to Satoshi Pay. So yeah, I think that would be the most straightforward process.
Yes, that sounds exactly like what we had in mind. The point, like what's missing right now from our perspective, is just that we need some protocol how we do the registering part.
Yes, so we could agree on something, or we could make a new step, call it key onboarding, key registration or something, but essentially we would need to come up with a way to actually exchange these, onboard these keys, and we could go as far as making it a standard so that it's the same process and it's interoperable with anyone and everyone.
So we actually have, so first off, is it okay if we go 10 minutes over, since we kind of got a 10-minute late start? I'm good with that.
Hey, yep, I was just actually messaging people about that. So in fact, we can go 10 or 15 minutes over. So the hard cutoff time being 9:45 a.m. PST.
Okay. Cool. So in that regard, one of the other things that we're working on tangentially to this is the ability to kind of pre-register KYC. So we were talking about everything we've been talking about here is person to person. One of the other things that came up was business to business payments. And this gets a lot more complicated because business KYB, know your business stuff, is a lot more complicated and less standardized than know your customer. So this is kind of a manual process, and we're talking to Tempo, who does this manually, and so it's important to kind of get this done ahead of time, where we can say, if you're going to want to do business payments, let's register you ahead of time. And so we actually have not a SEP, but kind of a proposal that we did where it's essentially an augmentation of SEP 12, which is the way to upload customer data to somebody. But it's a protocol that says, I want to register an entity. Here's their tell me what personal data you need from them. I'm going to give it to you, and we can see if you're happy with them yet. Maybe you need more, I'll give you more data. But this might be useful. And I think, Andy, you were on that thread, right? Have you seen what I'm talking about?
Yes. I commented something earlier today, actually. I don't know if you saw it.
I just
I'm
not on this call. So.
Oh yeah, sure. So I wrote that the more I think about it, the more it occurs to me that it would seem from a protocol level, it might even seem cleaner to separate the actual transfer SEPs more from the KYC SEPs or from a KYC SEP, so that the KYC can be done ahead of time. And and it could still be done in the moment you do the transfer, because you either have not KYC'd yet, or the KYC or the data that you supplied is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, it would instead of just telling you need to provide more data like we do now, it would basically it would do the same but redirect you to the KYC endpoint, so that the KYC endpoint would become like the single source of truth for all things KYC. But of course, this is a tricky topic because it would require us to change the existing SEPs like SEP 6, SEP 24 also. So this is a bit of a hot topic, I guess.
Yeah. Definitely not eager to make changes to SEP 6 or SEP 24 right now. But for the process of this, if there was a protocol where somebody could register a user linked to a Stellar key, or rather a Stellar key and an optional memo for custodial solutions, that seems like it might allow you to kind of do this upfront registering, and then once Kauri or Tempo has accepted a client based on this registration process, then you could then Satoshi Pay's wallet can initiate a transfer using that SEP 10 key and optional memo, or I guess in your case it'll just be a key for SEP 10.
Yeah, like that separation of concern, SEP-wise, this is more the engineer talking. From a Satoshi Pay perspective, everything that enables us to also do the KYC ahead of time would do the job, I think.
Okay. Let me share that with you, Bubemi. I don't think I actually sent it to you originally, but I think this can allow for exactly what you're talking about. As long as you're willing to allow a Satoshi Pay wallet or a non-custodial wallet to register users in this way, I think we can do that technically. It doesn't seem that complicated, what you're asking.
Worst case, if it's really an issue to have a non-custodial client supply the actual KYC data, the personal information, worst case scenario, maybe we can have a fallback to an interactive KYC. But of course, it would allow for a much smoother user experience if we could supply the actual data.
Yeah, we've been focused really on, for this direct send receive stuff, we've really been focused on non-interactive because this is kind of, you know, this is a communication between two businesses normally. If I really want to, yeah, I see what you're saying. Let's try to do it the non-interactive way, and if, you know, if things really fall apart, then we can start to look at the interactive, you know, taking a KYC form from the receiving anchor and showing it in the wallet, similar to how SEP24 does it. I don't actually think we're going to need to get there, really. It seems like any receiving anchor is just going to say, here are the fields that I need.
Yeah, that sounds good from our end.
Cool. Okay. I feel good about that.
Wonderful. So do we feel like we have both kind of a short-term way for how we want to start testing and implementing this stuff, and then kind of a medium-term plan for building out something more kind of sustainable or long-term?
I think they're very similar approaches.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah.
It's Anthony. Michael, you asked me about SEP6, I think last week. Are you thinking of bringing that back or adding that to this new standard? Or
the question I had for you last week was more kind of a maintenance of SEP6. So we had, it seems like everyone in the ecosystem kind of likes to continue to use SEP6. So the thing I was asking about was just for security purposes. Currently, there's a lot of personal information that's sent over a GET request in the URL, which is, URLs are not really secure. They can be leaked through browser history or whatever. So we just want to change that endpoint to be a post request, which it sounds like you already did. So it was two separate, it had nothing to do with this. I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, so were there any last items that people wanted to discuss before before we end the roundtable for today?
Yeah, I have one more thing actually, because I said that there are like two paths that we are considering right now, and we discussed the second one, and this is quite actionable. But for the first path, we skipped that a little bit in the discussion now. Maybe we can do it very briefly, and I just want to hear if anchors have some specific thoughts on that. And this is if we were to do the direct sending, the direct payments directly from an anchor to another anchor, and we would just basically step in and like we would be the party initiating the whole flow for the user. We would like just connect the dots, and the user would then directly like send a payment, a fiat payment, for example, to the sending anchor, and the sending anchor upon arrival sends it to the receiving anchor. Is there, it's a bit hard to explain now in such short term, but are there any hard feelings from anchors about adding support for something like this, or not adding it, like to allow some other party to kick off the flow?
In this process, does the sending anchor need to know anything about what's happening, or does it simply accept deposits and issue tokens like an anchor has always done?
Yes, basically. So of course, the anchor still needs to control like the KYC flow, request more data, something like that, I suppose. But apart from that, it's always like it's always been.
Okay. So what I had understood from your flow there was the wallet itself would be the initiator of the transaction. And from a receiving anchor's point of view, they care about two things. One, we have good KYC data, we know who we're dealing with. Two, we've received proper payment. We received the tokens we expect to receive for this payment. Originally they were kind of conflated, where the person who provides the KYC is the same as the person that sends the tokens. I don't think that necessarily needs to be true, as long as both things are true, that as long as both things are provided, good KYC data and proper payment. Do those actually need to, if Satoshi Pay can provide KYC either through Finclusive or through however the anchor accepts, and the receiving anchor gets the money they expect, is that enough? Because if that's the case, then the sending anchor doesn't really need to know that they're part of this payment protocol. They just need to know they've accepted some fiat, they've sent a token to an address.
Just to say, we do that right now with some of the crypto anchors, like Papaya Bot and NAO BTC.
What do you mean? What is that you do?
Essentially, we sell the client like an NAO BTC Bitcoin, and then they choose to send it to their Bitcoin address. They're doing a withdrawal on that anchor.
Mm-hmm.
But it's behind the scenes. The client doesn't know.
Okay.
Okay, that doesn't sound too bad.
I think like as long as a transaction is coming from or an address that's whitelisted, we don't really care like if it is a client of a partner or whatever the case. Same thing, as long as we receive a fiat payment corresponding to a send receive transaction, we don't really care as long as it arrives. If the only question I think really is, do we have to connect the incoming fiat payment with the KYC of a particular wallet address? If we have to do that, that is also possible. I think it can be done because first of all, we already have a business relationship and a business agreement with Satoshi, for example, and then there's going to be whitelisting and onboarding of any wallet address. So as long as we go through that process, when any send receive transaction that comes in, we know that it's a wallet that belongs to Satoshi Pay and it's already been whitelisted, and we already have the KYC for it. So I think it sounds doable to me.
Yeah, it sounds overly complicated to expect that this sending, a sending anchor who's not actually originating this payment is going to become a part of it. But it seems totally straightforward for them to issue the tokens to the wallet, and then the wallet sends the money. And in that case, it's coming from an address that's been whitelisted, that's been registered in KYC properly.
Yeah, that's maybe the most straightforward thing to do.
Cool.
I had one question on this external memo field for Satoshi Pay, because I've seen it before that wallets who are initiating transfers, they often need their own reference to come in. So then essentially there's two memo fields, an external memo, and then our memo. Can you explain a bit how you see that working?
Oh yeah. So from our point of view, like you're referring to the external memo and the Stellar transaction memo, right?
Exactly.
So we don't really care about the Stellar transaction memo, but on payout, we would like to be able to add a custom text to the actual bank transfer reference, that text that's attached to those bank transfers usually. We know that of course you guys have to add your own text for yeah, referencing it later, I guess. But our goal is to also include some text or some code of ours, so that the receiving party can, like, the text that we want to add is primarily specified by our client. So if Anthony, you are our client in this case, you can enter some ID where you know, okay, this is payment X, and you would enter that in our wallet, and we would send this to Tempo on withdrawal, on payout, and then the idea is that Tempo adds this payment X memo that you, Anthony, as the user specified to that actual bank transfer text.
Great, thank you.
Okay, awesome. So if that is kind of one of our last trailing comments, then I'm going to go ahead and wrap this session up. I think we've had a lot of great discussions. Really excited about the progress we made on the multilateral KYC conversation. So thank you, Claudio, and also on the non-custodial wallet integration into the direct SEP transaction. So lots of stuff there. I know that there were a few points that we are going to need to follow up on. That's the nature of these discussions. So things will continue to be dynamic. But thank you so much, everyone, for your time and participation today. And thanks for everybody who is tuning in.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.